Welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining us um, for this conversation. I think is probably a better word, a conversation with Annie rather than interview. Annie, I'm sure, needs no introductions. You're, I'm sure everybody is already a fan, having read and thoroughly enjoyed Cecily. And well, I know from comments I've already received, some have already read The King's Mother and are looking forward to further insights from Annie. The conversation or interview this evening is going to be led by one of our MHS members, Judith Cudahy, who is also a co-admin of the Archeo Book Club. And so when we were organising this, I thought, well, Judith is the perfect person to have a conversation with Annie. So I'll hand over to you, Judith and Annie.
Hi, thanks.
Hey, thank you very much, Philip. Nosweta, croeso I Bob, and croeso I Annie. It's my great pleasure to interview for, I think it's the second time, this time for The King's Mother, which is, of course, the sequel to your absolute sort of stunning debut, Cecily. So without further ado, would you please set the scene for The King's Mother? Where do we pick up the story? What's happening? Tell us everything.
Okay, so Cecily, the previous book, took us through, I guess, Cecily Neville's younger years from 1431 to 1461. And this second novel picks up more or less where Cecily left off. So the novel opens at Easter of 1461, and our heroine, Cecily, it's probably fair to say, quite stressed. It's Easter, and in the previous few months, in the previous Christmas New Year period, her husband, Richard, Duke of York, and her second son, Edmund, were both killed in battle at the Battle of Wakefield. She was in London at the time. She sent her younger sons out of the country for their safety and protection. Her eldest son, Edward IV, was in Wales recruiting troops to support his father when he heard news of his father's death. He went on to win a fairly conclusive battle at Mortimer's Cross, came then to London, received his crown, accepted his crown, but there was no time for a coronation or anything of that nature. He had to head north immediately, where another army, another Lancastrian army, was waiting to fight him. An army which was formidable, and I think it's probably true to say that it must have felt that the chances of his success were fairly slim. And when he goes north to fight this army, he leaves his mother Cecily in charge of his new kingdom. So while he's off fighting, she's in Westminster, keeping all the plates spinning and keeping all of the balls in the air, and really being responsible for the new kingdom. So you can imagine she's quite stressed.
She's running HQ. I mean, that is a big responsibility. She's holding everything together.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to me that he left his mother in charge. You know, he was astute in making that decision, I think, because while Edward is 18 years old and formidable in battle, he's comparatively young and politically inexperienced. His mother, by contrast, is extremely politically experienced, having served an apprenticeship in the game of politics alongside her husband, Richard, Duke of York, for the past 30 years or so. But I guess it's not too much of a spoiler because it happens in chapter 1. Edward wins, hurrah! And he wins a conclusive victory at the Battle of Towton, which, you know, as many of you will know, is reputed to be the bloodiest battle in the Wars of the Roses. And it's estimated that something like 10% of the fighting age male population of the country dies at Towton. So it is fierce and vicious fighting. And I guess that means that as the novel gets underway, Cecily has finally become the king's mother. She's in pole position. And I guess that makes her the #1 lady in England. But she is not unchallenged in that role. And as the book continues, we will meet 3 other challengers who will fight to put their son on the throne and therefore become king's mother themselves.
But I think it's important to emphasize that Cecily, I believe, is the first person to fully coin that title and use it. I think it's been kind of alluded to by, I believe, Joan of Kent in the past, but she's the one who really makes it her own for the first time in history and possesses that role and creates that identity. So they're all trying to topple her. She's
that's right. And it's interesting to me, you know, is this a fight for the survival of the House of York and to put her son on the throne? Yes, it's certainly that. But it's also a sign of her ambition and her sense of her own importance. And she is the first woman in England to use that title, you know, Lady Cecily, the King's mother. She says she will no longer be known as Lady Cecily, the Dowager Justice of York, but Lady Cecily, the King's mother. And you know, and that as a formal title, not just a biological fact. And I can't help but think of that as a real power play, because she is very clearly saying, don't for one moment think that there is any other woman in the kingdom more important than me.
I think one of our book group members actually said when I explained what the title of the sequel was, she said, "Go Cecily, lay your power down."
Absolutely, lay your power down. It's fantastic, isn't it?
So yeah. So I think you were planning to perhaps treat us to a reading from the early stages of when this is all going on and
yes.
give us a taste of, for those who haven't perhaps read the book.
Yeah, I thought I would. And it's from chapter 3 of the book. And it's when Edward has come back to London after this dreadful battle and is finally crowned. And as I said earlier, you know, Cecily has been through the most dreadful series, you know, dreadful few months of loss and grief and horror and panic and stress. Finally, she's achieved this. And so I thought I'd just give you a flavour of what it must have felt like for her to see Edward crowned. So it's the 29th of June, 1461, and we're, of course, in Westminster. Now her son comes to the world's table, and is himself the feast laid upon it. 2 days Edward has sat enthroned in Westminster Abbey. Yesterday, England's nobility came on their knees to kiss his hand and swear allegiance. Today, the common people are welcomed in to Gorp. It pleases her to see it. If she had her way, she'd drag in every man from the street, every labourer from the fields, shake them by the collar and say, "Look at this king I've given you, this sun I've put in your sky." To make the message of him plain, she's had it painted out on gilded boards that line the abbey's aisles, so that people must file past them as they wait. On the largest, at the entrance to the choir, the tangled lineages of Lancaster and York grow upward through a rose briar, each Lancastrian head a cankered flower, each Yorkist bloom engorged and strong. At the head of the plant, a golden Edward sits cushioned on roses, while beneath him, Mad Henry, dizzied, empty-handed and uncrowned, flails among thorns. It is the world as Cecily sees it, and officers of the crown are briefed and ready to explain its meaning to all. That Edward is king by right, by conquest, and by God's order. That he has put down the usurper and set their world to rights. That England will flourish under his hand, that their purses and bellies will be full. For the nobles, yesterday, her message was simpler. The House of York is here to stay. get used to it. At last night's coronation feast, she watched them finding their feet in this world remade. Those who had fought with Edward laughed loud and drank deep. Those grateful to be pardoned for fighting against him ate frugally and kept their mouths shut, unless to praise the king or ask for salt. That is until, as custom demands, the king's champion clattered his warhorse into Westminster Hall and offered to prove his sword against any who opposed Cecily's son. Then they cheered the loudest, knowing her eyes to be upon them. All but one. That chit of a girl, Margaret Beaufort, didn't cheer. With eyes as sharp as her chin, she watched horse and rider career about the hall, as if their offer of violence concerned her not at all. She only laid her hand on her husband's wrist and then, noticing Cecily's gaze, raised a cup to her and drank. There will always be reminders, Cecily supposes, that her sister Anne's family fought for Lancaster. This Beaufort girl is married to Anne's son Henry, but he's not her first husband. She was married before him to the Mad King's half-brother Edmund Tudor, and while still a child himself, bore him a son who still lives. Well, Cecily sighs, that's one more thing I must deal with. That's where she should be today, she thinks, taking care of such business, instead of indulging herself in the brightness of the Abbey and the sight of her son. But for now, surely she's done enough. Let today be a feast she savours. She's been so hungry for so long, and yesterday, at Edward's crowning, had gorged on joy till she thought she would die of it. When he had turned from his anointing and raised his crowned head, and Archbishop Bocher had called out to ask if England would have Edward as king, her whole body, viscera, bones, and flesh, had cried out, yes, though her mouth could form not a single word, gulping instead on light-spangled air. And the roar that filled the Abbey threatened to burst her heart as every voice cried out for her son, and the bells rang and rang. Even now, the memory of it sets her heart reeling. She shakes herself, comes back to the present. One can't live long in such moments, she thinks, so close to the sun, without burning. So you get the impression she rather likes Edward, don't you?
Just a bit. That's such an evocative passage. I love it. And for me, the way that you just give a wonderful nod there to the conspicuous consumption and the way that the Nevilles and family and the York have such an amazing management of marketing through imagery as well. Just a perfect little Easter egg from my point of view as an art historian. But so you mentioned Margaret Beaufort there. So as part of Cecily, although we start to hear Cecily's is the prime voice, it's her story, but we start to hear a little bit more about some of those other women you mentioned who might just have a little bit to say about her being the king's mother and might see what she's achieved and want a little bit of that for themselves and maybe their sons. So can you tell us a little bit about them, the other women you bring into the narrative?
Yeah, I love this part of the story because from 1461, the story really opens up to take in those other three big female powerhouse women of this period, I think. And at different times and for different reasons and in different circumstances, they will all compete with Cecily for the role of King's mother. And the first of them is Marguerite of Anjou, Henry VI's French queen, who, as the novel begins, is down because her husband has been kicked off his throne unceremoniously, but she is very far from out. And Cecily knows that very well. And Marguerite, you know, she's had a much tougher time of it than Cecily. You know, she's known Cecily since she was about 15 years old, when Marguerite was brought over from France to marry Henry VI. And Cecily met her in Rouen when she was making that journey into the kingdom as a young girl. And you know, I can't help but think that Marguerite must have looked at Cecily with her very capable husband, Richard, Duke of York, and her growing family of children, and looked at Henry VI, who, as far as kings go, was pretty close to the top of the useless pile, and thought, I get this one? You know, not at all what I think Marguerite would have expected her husband, the English king, to be. But Marguerite has managed, through her long marriage, to have a child with Henry, perhaps by Henry, perhaps not, but she has a young prince. And Cecily, who has known Marguerite for all of that time, knows just how hard Marguerite is going to fight. So as the novel opens, Marguerite of Anjou is the clear and present danger to Cecily's position and to Edward's position. And she knows she cannot take her eyes away from her. She says in a very early stage of the book, don't to Edward, you know, don't for 1 minute think we can sit back on our laurels. We have still got a fight on our hands. So that's Marguerite, and she is going to fight. The next big lady is Elizabeth Woodville, and reputedly the most beautiful woman in England at her time, and certainly that portrait of her that I'm sure we've all seen in the National Portrait Gallery is, to my mind, one of the most startling portraits of the Middle Ages. And I have spent many hours sitting in front of it, trying to fathom this woman. She becomes Edward IV's queen. And that's probably an eventuality that Cecily is not all that best pleased about. Because although Elizabeth is noble, she is several rungs down the ladder from where you would expect a king to marry. She's also older than Edward. She's also a widow. She's the widow of a Lancastrian who has just died fighting against Edward. And she's already the mother of 2 sons by that previous marriage. She brings nothing to the marriage in terms of wealth or status or land holdings or political advantage. She brings nothing to the marriage other than a large group of siblings, all of whom have to be elevated in order to be appropriate as the king's family.
And indeed, she's potentially precluding Edward from making other more advantageous European alliances that they could well do with.
Absolutely. And certainly, I think at the time of the marriage, Cecily was very much hoping for a French marriage alliance, which would have been very beneficial. And perhaps anticipating his mother's response to Elizabeth Woodville, Edward married her in secret and didn't fess up about it until he absolutely had to, because the Earl of Warwick, his cousin, had organised a marriage to Bona of Savoy, who would have brought a very rich dowry and a close alliance with France. So, you know, it's not great, okay? And it's Edward's womanizing, his weakness for women, his lack of political judgment when it comes to women, that will bring so much trouble to the House of York. And it's a marriage that really upsets so much of the English nobility, because you can imagine so many noble families thinking, well, if he can marry Elizabeth Woodville, he could have married my daughter, you know. And certainly it puts the Earl of Warwick's nose firmly out of joint, and that leads to all sorts of troubles, as we know. But, you know, Cecily and Elizabeth, Cecily, presented with a fait accompli, accepts Elizabeth, does everything in her power to sort of support and promote her queenship. And Elizabeth does a fairly good job, and I won't say too much about how her story develops in the book. But suffice to say that she gives Edward 2 sons, and after Edward dies, goes so far as to mount a rebellion and attempt an assassination in order to preserve the throne for her 2 boys. So she's going to be a contender too. She is going to be a fighter. And then, of course, there was an allusion in that reading, wasn't there, to Margaret Beaufort? And you won't have missed the name Edmund Tudor, and we kind of all know where Margaret Beaufort ends up. Her son is Henry Tudor. But of course, you know, I found during the writing of this book, my respect for Margaret Beaufort grew in spades, because she had, to my mind, such courage and was, I think, such an intellectual match for Cecily. And yet her life had got off to such a bad start. You know, she famously had her son Henry Tudor when she was barely 13 years old, having been married at the age of 12 to King Henry's half-brother Edmund Tudor, really because she was a very rich heiress, and it was a way of giving his half-brother land and titles and wealth without the king having to actually spend any money. But the way the marriage contract was written meant that if she died before there was issue in the marriage, he would not inherit. So he was under quite a lot of, he was quite determined to make sure that there was issue from that marriage as quickly as possible. So 12 years old, he took her to bed and got her pregnant, which even by the standards of the day was
frowned upon, shall we say?
Absolutely, it was appalling. Marriages were often made young, but not consummated until the girl was 15 or 16. And it's thought that Margaret was so badly damaged by that experience and that early pregnancy and birth that she was incapable of conceiving again. Now, we can't say whether that's true or not, but suffice to say that despite marrying twice more after her first husband's death, she never has another child. And she also has good sense too when she marries subsequently to negotiate her own marriage contracts. She's not going to get caught out twice.
She learns quickly.
She learns very quickly, and she learns, interestingly, from Cecily.
Yeah.
And I think throughout, you know, they meet here at the beginning of the novel in 1461, and I think for the 20 years following, Cecily and Margaret have a very interesting relationship.
Very much so. And of course, that is a meeting that we know did indeed take place. So.
Yes, yeah. And you do get the impression, don't you, that these were 2 women who had a friendship, who respected each other, who spent time together. And I don't think, for 99% of the novel, that Cecily sees Margaret as a threat. But ultimately, she absolutely is. And you might say that she's the knife in the dark that Cecily doesn't see coming.
And yet she's also the friend of sorts.
She's also the friend. And that to me is the interesting thing, because this book, you know, is it about the Wars of the Roses? Yes. Is it about 15th century history? Yes. But it's really a book about mothers and sons, and about matriarchal power plays, and about what mothers will do for their sons, or put it another way, what they won't do.
Yeah. And would you also say it's about networks of women as well?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, I've been reading about this period of history for years, and maybe I'm not very bright, but it was years before I really realized how intimately connected these 4 women are. You know, reading the history textbooks through my 20s and 30s and so on, I got the impression these were 4 disparate women who didn't really know each other, didn't have much to do with each other. And I think that's largely because the sort of male-dominated historical tradition has only been interested in the women insofar as they relate to their men. So Cecily is Edward's mother. Margaret Beaufort is Henry's mother. Elizabeth is Edward's wife. But they were also a great deal to one another. You know,
Absolutely.
Cecily and Marguerite were good friends for most of the time. Elizabeth Woodville was the daughter of Cecily's friend and associate, Jacquetta of Bedford. And, you know, when you think about it, Jacquetta and Cecily were in France together when they were young and when both of their husbands were stationed there at a time when they were both starting their families. And Elizabeth was 5 years older than Edward. I almost imagine a sort of 5-year-old Elizabeth peering into the crib at the newborn newborn Edward IV.
And there's a tiny but beautiful moment where you mentioned that, and it's such a lovely, it's so such a nugget. It's so small and so perfect, but you allude to that in the book. And I was thinking also, I mean, the networks between them, we have tangible evidence they lent books to each other. They were
Yes.
all literate, and we have many of those books still in the Royal Collection in Abbotsford, in all over. We know that there was exchange, there was borrowing, that was passed down female lines. So these are literate women who have an interest in high culture that they all share and promote to different
Absolutely.
degrees. And I think
Yeah.
that's, really, I think you mentioned at some point that Cecily admires Margaret's library, or she thinks she has a lovely little collection of books and that is
Yeah.
such an important link that we still have between them all
Yeah.
in libraries across Europe. So
Yeah. And it is fascinating because when you think about it, you know, they're part of a very small elite group of high status women. And they are intimates. And that makes the ultimate betrayals that go on between them
all the
all the
more
more savage. Because you're not taking a pop at a distant enemy. You're putting the dagger into the rib of a woman you've known for years and shared all those friendship moments with. So it's personal.
very. And it all comes down to those sons that you mentioned. So you could tell us a little bit more about the sons, perhaps, and Cecily particularly, and her handling of her many remaining sons from the beginning of this book, and the
Yeah,
dynamics between them. 'Cause she has a lot to negotiate there as well with the
yeah,
family dynamic, shall we say?
yeah, yeah. What a family! I often say that Cecily, the first book, is about how Cecily builds a dynasty, and this second book is about how the kids make a mess of it. And it kind of is. So by the time this book opens, Cecily, who has had 12 children, 7 of whom grew into adulthood, 4 boys and 3 girls, has just 3 boys remaining because she's already lost Edmund that previous Christmas. And Edward, who is now the king, I can't help but feel was something of a favourite for Cecily. And in a way, it isn't all that surprising. She waited 8 years between consummating her marriage and having a live birth. And we don't quite know why, but that must have been a very stressful time. And she finally has a son who dies within days of his
Yes.
birth.
Yeah.
She then goes on to have a daughter. She finally then has Edward when she's in France with Jacquetta. And I just have a strong sense of how bound to get, what a great relief and event that must have been to finally have this boy child and to have fulfilled her, the duty of an aristocratic medieval woman. And of course, he grows up to be everything you would want a prince to be. He's famously 6'4", the tallest man in England. He wins every battle you throw him into. Men love him. Women adore him. You sometimes feel Edward is so hot that she can barely touch him, And yet he is a
He's still got
young
time for his
god.
mum.
He's still got time for his mom, and they're very close, and he respects her. And to me, that's Edward being very sensible, because he appreciates that no one is going to be as loyal to him as his mother. And he also appreciates that she's a very sharp card and that she knows exactly what she's doing. She's very experienced. So you do get the feeling, particularly early in his reign, before he marries, that she does fulfill that role of confidant, counsel, guide. I have Edward several times in the book, taking himself downriver to Baynard's to have a chat late at night with his mum, and she planting ideas in his head, which she knows will be his in the morning. And that does feel very real, and that she helps him grow into his kingship. But he is a young god with feet of clay, and it's women that get him into trouble. And it did with Elizabeth Woodville, and it will again. And Cecily's constantly clearing up the mess there. And then we have the difficult middle son, George. And what I often say to people is, if you're thinking about it, who George is, think George is to Edward what Harry is to William today. He's that second son, the spare, who just can't bear it. He just can't bear not being number one. He's envious and jealous. And, at the beginning of the novel, until Edward marries and has children, he's Edward's heir. But then once Elizabeth starts breeding and there are sons, his nose is pushed even further out of joint. And it leads him into repeated treacheries and rebellions alongside his cousin, the Earl of Warwick. And I found myself just fascinated by this and thinking about how do you, as a mother, continue to love a child, who seems hell-bent on destroying your family? And by destroying your family, I don't just mean besmirching their reputations in the newspapers the way Harry has with the royal family now. I mean killing them. And does that love just become ever more exquisitely painful, and how will that play out? So that's George, difficult middle boy. And then you can't not talk about Richard, her youngest. And this is always difficult because it's hard to say anything about Richard III without someone wanting to thump you. They either believe that he's the child murdering hunchback tyrant of Shakespeare, irredeemable character, or he's a regular guy who got a bad press in the post-war Tudor propaganda. And there seems to be no middle ground in that. But all I would say is that when people think of Richard III, they tend to look only at that fateful summer of 1483, when his brother Edward dies, leaving Richard as protector for his two sons. And within a matter of weeks, Richard has, those two princes, those two boys have disappeared, and Richard is sitting on the throne of England. What happened in that couple of, in those weeks? Did Richard usurp the throne? Did he kill those boys? If he didn't, what happened to them? Who else did he kill? And reach conclusions based just on an examination of that short period. And what people often fail to take into account is the 31 years of life that Richard had before the summer of 1483. So I was at pains in writing this book to at least examine the whole of Richard's life. And my impression of him is, he's the last of Cecily's children. He's 12th in line. She does have a child after him. She has a daughter, Ursula, but she dies very young. So effectively, he's their youngest. He's born at a point when the wars between Cecily's husband and Henry VI are at a real crisis point. So he's born in the middle of conflict. Not a great time to be having yet another baby. It must have been very stressful. And you can kind of feel he might not have got the attention and love that might have been, poured onto Edward. It's always, well, we've got Edward, of course, and we've got George, and then there are the girls, and then, there's this one, Richard, there's Richard, of course, the sort of come lately son. But all through his life, he's kind of the opposite of George, where George is fickle and treacherous. Richard appears to be diligent and loyal. He just gets on with it. And he's loyal to Edward, even when that loyalty looks like it could cost him dearly, even when that loyalty brings him into intense personal danger. And I think that's very interesting. And if we look at his career, which is marked by, political successes, good lordship, fine judgments, and then fast forward to the summer of 1483 and just think, okay, what would a man with that experience, that character, that life experience, put him in that summer of 1483 at a time of intense pressure? His brothers just died, the French looked like they were about to invade, the factions that Edward IV managed to hold together are splitting apart all around him. What is a man of that character going to do? How is he going to respond to circumstances? And I'm not going to say how I think he responds, because you need to read the book.
You do indeed. I mean, that's something that's so hard to negotiate for any writer, isn't it? Because this is one of the greatest cruxes of any sort of medieval historian of this period, let alone somebody who's approaching it from a fictional perspective. I mean, and all I will say is that you establish your position, and you absolutely, it's totally plausible. So whatever anyone believes otherwise, in the narrative of the book, you really pull off complete conviction with your take on it. But yeah, it's such a challenge to choose. I mean, were you basing it as well on what would make a good story, as well as your was there, did you have to make a choice, or did it sort of seem to all fall in place?
I think this is the crux of the matter, isn't it, between historical fact and fiction, and writers of historical fact and fiction. And my feeling is, as a novelist, you have to be true to the history. You have to anchor it. You have to anchor your story in historical truth. And in this period, there are things that we know, and there are things that we absolutely do not know. And people may read this book and hugely disagree with some of the conclusions I have reached about those unknowns, about Richard III, but about other things too. That's completely fine. I don't have a problem with that at all, because ultimately we don't know. But I am comfortable that I would be able to say, well, I have come to that conclusion because of this, and this in the historical record. You have to go with what, if we don't know something, if we don't know what happened in that fateful summer of 1483, you have to look at the evidence, look at what we do know, and make the creative leap of imagination that says, what is likely? What is plausible? What fits with the personality of this character and experience? And go from there. People are welcome to disagree, and I'm sure they will, but I hope it makes people think, at least.
And one of the great strengths of The King's Mother, and indeed Cecily before, is it's wholly character driven as well. So that is what makes your argument so, I think, for me personally, very compelling, and carry through the entire narrative from the initial book to The King's Mother with such powers, because we're always going back and revisiting what we know of the characters.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point about the book being character driven, because inevitably, when you're writing historical fiction, you find yourself thinking a lot about how do you create suspense? How do you get the reader to that, I'm sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I am going to read the next chapter, even though I have to get up for work because I must find out,
Guilty.
Yeah. How do you create that when everyone knows what happens in the end? Everyone knows that Henry Tudor's going to win, right? So how do you create suspense? And the only way you can do it is by making people 100% invest in the characters, so that they're actually reading on, not to find out what happens so much, but to find out how the characters are going to react to what happens. What's it going to feel like? You know, a historian can tell you what happened, but a novelist can tell you what it felt like.
And indeed, that's you could argue that the sort of culmination of the Wars of the Roses is sort of almost like watching a slow car crash.
Yes.
To want to watch that when is a whole other matter, even when you, yeah, I mean, the real skill behind that.
Yeah.
So I guess one of the questions that comes from asking that is, with reading The King's Mother, what are you hoping readers are going to get from that and take away? What was your aim and your wish for the novel?
Yeah. I think two things really. And the first is what we were talking about earlier, you know, recognizing this society of women that did wield power. And people often describe it as soft power. You know, I'm not always sure how soft it was. You know, I think it was pretty hard power. And I think that's been ignored and brushed under the carpet and underestimated for far too long. And when you think about it, you know, we all know that Henry VII beats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Yes. But Henry would never have made it to the battlefield if his mother hadn't paved the way for him. So Margaret Beaufort absolutely is the founder of the Tudor dynasty. It would never have happened unless she had taken the extraordinary risks that she took in 1484-85 to bring Henry back from exile to the Battle of Bosworth. Now, these women did stuff, and I want people to recognize that. So that's the most important thing for me, I think, that women and their power needs to be recognized. And the other thing, I think, comes back to character, and it's about, you know, history is very good at making people into cardboard cutouts and caricatures. It's definitely done it with Richard III. It's done it with so many others. And it's easy, you know, we tend either to support Lancaster and think the Yorkists are terrible, or we support the Yorkists and we think the Lancastrians are terrible. Of course, none of them are. They're all just regular, complicated, complex people who do good stuff and bad stuff sometimes, you know, and let's dig underneath the historical caricatures that have been handed down to us and try and find out what these people were really like.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you and I have talked before about how easy it is to say that the women were witnesses and they were survivors and they were very pious, but there's less talk about direct agency. And I mean, Cecily herself, her estates were vast and she continued to manage them herself.
Yes.
And indeed, we meet her at the beginning of The King's Mother, and Cecily focuses on her younger married years, her fruitful years. But I think something for me personally that spoke to me directly is we meet Cecily. She's 40 plus. She's no longer childbearing. She is at a period where a lot of women, even now, are being dismissed as no longer really of great worth or not having so much to contribute. And she not only owns it and reinvents herself, but she is really driven and she is absolutely the most, such a dynamic figure. And yet she isn't young and glamorous, and you know, she's not the toast of the court or the beauty that her daughter-in-law is held to be, and she is still absolutely the center of business policy making, if not even more so than when she was married to Richard, Duke of York. And I think as a older women are frequently written out of history, and that's such a powerful story to tell.
Someone said to me the other day that who'd read the book, and they said it was so fantastic to see a postmenopausal female as the main character and really exercising her power. And I thought, yeah, right on.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you every now and then, you don't labour it, but you do mention things like she's getting a little bit stiff now.
Yes.
You know, she loves her riding and she loves to be active, but it is taking its toll, but she's damned if she's not gonna carry on. And
and when you think, you know, she lives 10 years after Bosworth.
She lives in she's 80, I believe.
She dies in 1495 at the age of 80. And even in that last 10 years of her life, because Henry VII pretty much left her alone. She still continued to manage vast estates and land holdings and exercise good ladyship. She was active, right? She didn't come to court very much in those 10 years, but she was active. And she maintained an active relationship with Margaret Beaufort.
Indeed, and she reinvents herself as the Queen's grandmother.
Absolutely, she does, yeah. And the other thing that happens is that Margaret Beaufort models her behaviour absolutely on Cecily's, and you can really see that. She takes on that title, King's Mother, and she, in the way that she operates in relation to Henry, the way she manages her own household, it very much reflects the way Cecily did with Edward. And they're a generation apart. And I can't help
Cecily's still the template.
Yeah. The role
The
model,
next generation.
the woman. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's fantastic, isn't it?
It's such something to really, really think about. And again, not just women being marginalized, but the older woman, and hearing that voice is absolutely, I think really what makes The King's Mother so fascinating. I mean, it as a book in its own right, as as well as a companion to Cecily.
Yeah.
So I think obviously, I mean, this is your great achievement, which you always wish to do. It's always your ambition, I know, to tell Cecily's story from an early age, but you're done. What's next?
That's a really good question, because these two books, this story has been my life's ambition. It's what I always wanted to do from being very young, and it is done. And it's fantastic to see it ink on pages between boards and finally finished. And as I was writing The King's Mother, I found myself thinking, well, is this it? Once this book is out, am I done? Do I then go and do something else? Take up needlepoint or something? Have another career? Or do I want to be a novelist now? And I genuinely didn't know. I wasn't sure. And then one day I was having a chat with my editor, and she said, have you had an idea about a third book? And I found myself saying, well, there's this woman, Isabella. It's quite interesting. And that's Isabella of France, who's the queen of Edward II, also not the brightest spark as a king, and eventually deposes him, rebels against him and deposes him, and possibly, has him murdered. Who knows? And she said, we'll contract that right now. And I found myself signing a contract to write a book about Isabella. So I thought, I must want to be a novelist then. Question answered. So yes, I'm working on a book about Isabella, which brings me firmly into Mortimer territory, of course, with Edward II and Roger Mortimer and all of those good folks. But it is slightly terrifying because, I've been living with Cecily for 40 years. I haven't been living with Isabella for 40 years. So,
and I can't imagine Cecily's particularly content to go away entirely.
No, and I don't have 40 years left to do it again. So I've got to find a way to work faster and work smarter. But yeah, so work has begun, but it's going to take a while.
And in the meantime, I believe you've got you're touring with the King's Mother, doing lots of conversations, lots of interviews, lots of meeting people who have want to read or have read the book. But I think there's also an exciting TV deal in the pipeline. Oh, it's been agreed, has it not? So
yes. Cecily, the first book, has been optioned for TV by a company called Just John Films. I think we're just at the point of choosing the screenwriter who will adapt it. But it's very early days. I'm told that this can be a very long process, and the end is uncertain. But it's very exciting, and the way I'm looking at it at the moment is just I'm enjoying it. I'm having fun because I'm meeting interesting people and having fascinating conversations in a world I know nothing about, TV. So that's just good fun at the moment.
Fantastic. So I think I have a question, if I may, if I may, and then I think we'll probably open it up for people to either raise their hands or possibly pop a question in the chat. But if you wouldn't mind satisfying my own curiosity, Annie, something that I find personally spoke to me is that the characters we meet in The King's Mother and indeed Cecily, they're absolutely 15th century. They have a 15th century worldview. Their philosophy is 15th century. It's completely sort of in some ways alien to our sort of the way we live now. And yet, for me as a reader, I hope for others, it's completely recognizable. Even for somebody who may be not familiar with the time period. I mean, I personally studied the 15th century in depth at one point in my previous lives. But how, as a writer, do you achieve that sense of connection, do you think, between what is obviously a different way of thinking and yet is still so very in the way your writing style, so very relevant and so very recognizable for us as readers now?
Yeah, I'm glad you feel that, because I think that's the thing I'm most worried about writing both of these books, about how you create characters that are authentically 15th century, not like us, and yet make them relatable to a modern audience. And I felt that was going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. But I hate it sometimes when you read some historical fiction now and it feels like you're reading about modern people in fancy dress. You know, they have our values and our mindset, and they think and walk and talk like us, but they just have much better frocks, you know. So I wanted to acknowledge those differences. For example, the sort of extreme religiosity of these characters, which is so different to the way we feel. And people have described these novelists as feminist retellings, and I'm slightly uncomfortable with that. I mean, I guess that, you know, any woman who writes a book about women in history, that in itself is a feminist act, I guess. But Cecily and Margaret and Marguerite and Elizabeth, they're not feminists. They're not modern in that way. They're 15th
I think if
century
you could
aristocratic
go
women.
back and explain to them what that is, they would probably be slightly horrified.
Absolutely horrified. But what they do have in common with us is motherhood and love for their children and love for their partners and ambition, envy, all of those human emotions, friendships between women, all of those things that they're common to us in the 21st century and common to them in the 15th, aren't they? So I think you have to, as a writer, just plug into, expose the differences and try and make them comprehensible, but really key in to the similarities, to the shared human experiences, because they don't change that much.
No, indeed. I think somebody said recently medieval history is all about family at the end of the day.
Definitely the Wars of the Roses is.
So,
Absolutely.
so,
Yeah.
and I think,
you know, this is a story about mothers and sons and dysfunctional families.
I think even if you don't have one yourself, most people know one. So.
Oh yeah. 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 Yeah.
So I think it's time, Philippa, for to open the floor to other questions, either in the chat or if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask any questions themselves.
That's right. Thanks very much to both of you. It's been fascinating to listen to, a tremendous amount of insight. But yes, we've got a bit of time. There's still time before the 800 meters starts. So there's time for questions from anybody. As Judith said, you can put questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand by clicking on the relevant thing, which is on my screen has changed from where it used to be. Right, we've got one question from Alison. Is it necessary, Annie, to read the books in order? Can one leap straight into The King's Mother without reading Cecily?
Yeah, I'm absolutely confident that you could leap straight into The King's Mother without reading Cecily and you would be completely fine. The two novels have quite distinct narrative arcs. So yes, if you feel compelled to start reading The King's Mother, crack on and read it. If you enjoy that, you can always go back and read Cecily.
Indeed. I mean, from having read both myself, I would agree that one can. My only thought was that if you read Cecily first, you get a much deeper appreciation of the King's Mother.
Yeah.
In terms of as Judith was saying, because and you were saying, Annie, because of the way in which the books are character driven.
Yes.
Then you get that sense of where the characters have come from.
Yes, and certainly, I mean, they're obviously chronological. And I guess the thing that you do get from reading them in order, particularly with Cecily, is her maturation from being a very young girl of 16 at the beginning of Cecily to being a woman of 70 at the end of The King's Mother. You get that whole lifespan of experience. Yeah.
And I think this is a comment rather than a question from Mary. Thank you so much for the talk. Congratulations on the TV deal, and I look forward to reading your book.
Oh, thank you very much.
I will continue to. Oh, sorry, my screen has just jumped. I will continue to promote your books in my genealogy history groups on Facebook.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Joanna, to Annie, did you have a favourite character to write other than Cecily? And she adds, thank you very much for the talk. So apart from Cecily, who's your favourite character, Annie?
That's really hard. I mean, as I said when I was talking, I came to appreciate Margaret Beaufort so much more in the writing of, in the actual writing of The King's Mother. I came to such an appreciation of her intelligence and her courage. So she was fantastic to write. I had a lot of fun writing Elizabeth Woodville. Because, yeah, someone said to me the other day, Elizabeth's quite irritating, isn't she? And I was like, yeah, she can be quite irritating, but nevertheless. So I enjoyed writing all of the women, and then if I turn it on its head and say, who did I enjoy writing amongst the men? I really enjoyed writing the Earl of Warwick, because I found the relationship between Edward and Warwick so fascinating. It was like it was in so many ways a bromance went wrong, And I'm sure that Warwick was nose out of joint because he saw his opportunities for advancement curtailed by the rise of the Woodvilles. But I think he was also, his heart was broken that he couldn't come first with Edward anymore. He never had the sort of emotional intelligence to get past that point. So I found writing him just intriguing, and I felt sorry for him. I felt sad for him.
And interesting question from Sheila. Judith has touched on the authenticity of the philosophy stroke culture you have evoked. How do you approach the use of language to keep that same sense of authenticity while still making it readable by us in the 21st century?
Yeah, this is the question of language is a difficult one in contemplation, but once you make a decision about it, it becomes much more straightforward. And I'll try to explain that. You'll find a lot of historical fiction about this period that tries to sort of create a faux 15th century way of talking, and it becomes a bit thee and thou, and it feels very pastiche. And I find it hard, and I find it a barrier then between myself and the story, because it isn't real. So my decision very early on was to use modern English and not to shy away from that at all, and be very colloquial even in my language, but to avoid, like the plague, anything that would be definitely anachronistic. For example, I remember reading a novel set in this period in which a character said, okay, which of course is not going to happen in the 15th century. So I think that's the rule that I set for myself. Avoid anachronisms, use modern English, and let these characters speak in a way that we will understand. And other writers have done that very well. I don't know if any of you have read Pat Barker's books, The Trojan Women, and she shamelessly uses very, very modern English, and it's just so powerful. It works so well. So I don't think I'm the only person who does it, and I'm sure there are other writers out there who do it better than me. But that was my thought process.
Can I just ask, as a supplement to that, Annie, because one of the things that I love about both Cecily and the King's Mother is your use of language, because I mean, apart from the characterization and the storytelling and so on, which are wonderful, the books are just such a joy to read because of your use of the English language. And so I sort of sit there in envy, the way in which you bring things to life through use of simile, adverbs, and so on. So anyway, so my question is that something that you consciously work at and polish as you are writing, or does it come naturally to you?
I work at it absolutely constantly. Constantly. I mean, I think if I had two ambitions in writing these books, it's to tell this story in a way that is compelling, but along the way to write at least a few truly beautiful sentences. Just sentences that are beautiful for their own sake, that use striking images that take your breath. Because isn't that what you most admire in writers? I'm a huge fan of Hilary Mantel, as I'm sure you know. And that's what she does so well. She cannot write a bad sentence, that woman. Her sentences are beautiful and say so much. And there are so many layers of things going on in every sentence. So yes, I really do work very hard at fine tuning and polishing every word that goes into the book. Yeah.
And indeed, there are a lot more than a few such sentences. You'd be hard put to find a page where there aren't sentences that jump out. If I've got my tenses correct there. Anyway, are there any more questions, or are we drawing to a natural close? Okay. I think everybody's impatient for the start of the 800.
Well, that's great. And I want to see that too. I'm hoping we win. But I'd just say I'm going to be touring between now and October, and lots of events locally and further afield. You can find details of all of them at anniegarthwaite.com/events. And the book is available wherever you buy your books. And enjoy.